welcome to each of you as we get started with this March edition of the Pathway to Purpose webinar. We're thankful for your participation as together we seek to advance the kingdom through business. I'm Ken Powell, a member of the leadership team here at FCCI, the Fellowship of Companies for Christ International. And just before we bring in Dr. Molinaro for today's webinar presentation, let me highlight a couple opportunities here at FCCI. But first, if you would, let me just do this quick reminder I try to do every time to remind you just to introduce yourself. Take a moment. They're on LinkedIn, on YouTube, in the comments, the chat. We firmly believe that part of our calling here at FCCI is to help propel this global movement of servant leaders who help each other lead companies for Christ. Together, we are better. So as you connect here with one another today, we trust that God will open doors of opportunity for greater collaboration in kingdom endeavors. Well, we love providing these webinars each month, and there's nothing quite like, though, being together at the FCCI International Conference. For 4 days, we're connecting with like-hearted Christian business leaders, digging into outstanding conversations as we're guided by thought leaders. Well, this year, thought leaders like Donald Miller, Jordan Rayner, Richard Blackaby, Crawford Loritz, and more. So this year's conference is going to be absolutely wonderful. It's going to be at the Everline Resort in Lake Tahoe, California, September 15 through 18. And you can register for the conference at conference.fcci.org and consider getting you, your spouse, your whole team registered before March 31 if you want to take advantage of the early bird pricing that's available now. One more item before we get into the meat of our webinar today. Our weekly podcast continues to deliver powerful content that will inspire and encourage your journey as a Christian business leader. These past 3 episodes from Tony Evans, oh my goodness, they're just life-altering. At least they were for me. So don't miss episodes 51 through 53. Does your business reflect God's glory from Tony Evans? And starting next week, we launch into a series with Rick Warren entitled The 3 Greatest Leadership Challenges. So please allow us to serve your spiritual and leadership growth as you listen to our weekly podcast episodes, dropping in each Monday morning at 5 a.m. Eastern Time, nice and early on Monday. You can grab those on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for FCCI Pathway to Purpose podcast. Well, it's an honor to be able to welcome Dr. Nick Molinaro with Performance in Mind to our Pathway to Purpose webinar series. Nick, so good to have you with us.
Ken, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm certainly looking forward to it.
Well, we initially met last fall at an FCCI event in Raleigh, Durham. I was driving back then across I-40, and we got on the phone together. We had this wonderful conversation. It led to me taking the Attentional and Interpersonal Style Inventory, TAIS, and then my conviction that, boy, we really needed to have you come and share with us more about TAIS and what that does for a leader. So looking forward to this, Nick. Thanks so much.
Thank you again for the opportunity. And certainly I welcome any communications questions when you have them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to admit, though, Nick, as I went through, I was a little bit disappointed because after going through the TAIS and knowing that, you work with PGA professionals, I really had maybe a little bit of a wrong expectation that my golf game was just going to improve because I went through this thing. But unfortunately, it has not. So maybe I need to practice a little more. But share with us a little bit about the fact that you work with PGA professionals, top athletes, executive leaders. How did you get into this? And share with us a little bit more of the background.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm mostly known for my work on the PGA Tour and LPGA Tour. Part of that was because I was on the Golf Channel for 3 years, and I've worked with Michael Breed, and Michael has been one of my students in the past. How I got into all of this stuff was I was an amateur race car driver, and I was coming down the downhill at Lime Rock in the diving turn at about 85 miles an hour, and spun the car, had a broken arm and a concussion as I went into the guardrail, took another car out. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I was able to get myself back on track literally and became actually faster after I learned to use my own skill set. And that's how I got into this. Shortly after that, I said, whoa, let me work with golfers. I know that they have mental ability, conditions, and that's how it all started. I am also uh, I'm the recruiting psychologist for Rutgers men's uh, team. And Chris Gotterup, who's on the PGA Tour now. I worked with Chris when he was at Rutgers, then he transferred to Oklahoma.
Hmm.
And and Chris was on the Korn Ferry Tour for only 1 year, and so he now has his PGA card. And great man, and he went to Christian Brothers Academy, actually in New Jersey.
Wow. Wow, wow. Well, I tell you what, I am really excited to go through this content. Like I said, I went through the TAIS, I did the inventory, and Dr. Molinar walked me through that. I learned a lot about myself as a result of that process. So I'm excited about the fact that in our post webinar email, we're going to be providing direct access to Nick through his email address. You can reach out to him. He's going to be offering a TAIS group cohort experience to be able to go through that together for $100 per participant to go through this process that he's going to explain and walk us through here today. So there's going to be an opportunity for you to engage with this and take the next step following today's webinar. So look forward to that, and you'll learn more about that in our follow-up email here today. So well, before we just turn things over here and let him just get after it with this explanation and understanding of TAIS, I wanted to just remind you, please do submit your questions in the chat there, in the comments. We'd love to be able to interact with those following the presentation here. But without any further ado, Nick, I will just turn things over to you.
Thanks again, Ken. And you will be managing the slideshow here. So um, we can move on to the first one. And just like to explain my background, although I'm in sports psychology, as I've mentioned, I work with Olympic athletes. We have at least one Olympian returning in this year's Olympics in the summer, and hopefully another one on the way. But you can see that my skill set goes across, all aspects of business, financial services, manufacturing, shipping. And the reason that we use this is because you'll see that this is an assessment that looks at how you make decisions effectively. So although I'm a psychologist, they never use a personality test. And you'll see the reasons for it as we go through the TASE. The next slide, references some of the companies that we've worked with. And then the next slide just gives you some ideas about some of the sporting events that I've had some experience with. As I mentioned, I work with Rutgers, but I've had work clearly with athletes in the NFL, the NBA, MLB. Recently, I'm a rookie this year at the age of 76 in Major League Soccer, and a rookie when I was 74 in MLB. The reason that I'll highlight some of this is that what we find with athletes under performance under pressure is we can measure their performance by the training that we do. There's a high correlation between performance in sport and success in business. We'll address that as we go through this webinar. Thank you. What is the difference between faith and trust? And the reason I'm bringing this up is as a Christian, every individual that I see, whether it's in the corporate world or whether it's in sports, I always ask them, what do they have faith in? And I begin by trying to explain that there's a difference between faith and trust. Trust is a belief, and faith is a belief. Trust is a belief in proof from the past, and faith, as you know, is there's no proof and there's no doubt, and it's future oriented. So I always ask individuals when I first meet them, what do you have faith in? And frequently they'll say, well, do you mean God? And I'll say, sure, we can talk about God. And that's a very interesting way that I bring faith into my work. Everyone that I work with, I ask them a question about faith. And a lot of them have been led to explore more about that. I've had returning athletes come to me, after their season, they ask me to spend more time with them in my faith. The reason I'm bringing up Paul Peterson, who is a managing partner at WIS, is that I've been working with WIS for over 12 years. And one of the opportunities that we've had to work together is we're putting together a program now. I have over 1,000 TAIS that have been taken by accountants. And we're putting together a profile of what are the highest performing accountants and departments, whether that's tax or assurance. So we have a database that we're developing that will be able to help predict performance under pressure in that field. We're in the middle of that study currently. Thank you. The problem. So why did I call it the myths about psychological measurement? And the reason for that is that most people believe that there are two basic factors that really influence a person in their high-level performance. One is personality, and the other is confidence. I'm just going to address confidence very quickly now. Confidence is not a very good predictor of performance, in spite of the fact that most parents, most coaches, most athletes believe that confidence is the best predictor of performance. And it isn't. I will explain to you what it is. Confidence is based upon two phenomena: what you believe about your ability to perform and what you feel about your ability to perform. Now, if you look at where your beliefs and your feelings are in your brain, they're in an area that is highly susceptible to thinking. If you know anything about sports, you'll know that your best performance is when you're not thinking. In decision making in business, a lot of your decisions are made based upon a whole plethora of information, some of which is intuition. Intuition is a very effective system in decision making, although it doesn't get a lot of attention about the influence that it can have in performance. We'll talk about that briefly as well. As you look at over these issues about how do we pick the right people to be in positions of leadership, resumes, interviews, such things as executive presence, all those things are fairly abstract phenomena. So what do I use? Next slide. Here we go. 85% of the CEOs would agree they do not currently have the leadership required to execute their strategy effectively. You can go down through the rest of this information that kind of explains what's been happening in terms of leadership. We'll actually take a look at cognitive processes, which is not really being measured. And so in my work, I look at decision making under pressure, I look at cognitive processes, and I look at value systems as a way to predict who's going to be the most effective leader. Here are some factors that influence performance. They're relatively simple for you to be able to understand. The next slide will explain to you that the factor that influences us high-level performance is stress. Now, stress is simply defined as anything that moves the individual away from equilibrium. So if you've been to Disney World with children or grandchildren, or perhaps even when you were younger, you would notice that there's a lot of people walking around there that are not very happy. Stress, simply defined as anything that moves you from equilibrium. Try to go to Disney World and have a great time. That's not a usual phenomenon. Go back there again, you might notice how many parents are not really having such a great time. That's a good example of how stress might influence functioning. It's a very interesting study that was produced by the American Psychological Association. And those who typically feel tense, stress during work hours are 71% of the population. That's a very, very high percentage. I wonder why there's such a disgruntled factor kind of permeating through businesses at times. Thank you. Stress disrupts cognitive process. As you'll see in the next slide, you'll see areas, what's called the prefrontal cortex. You can see the green area when it's unstressed, and you can see what's actually happening when the brain is stressed. Now, that's a schematic, and really what it's showing is that the limbic system, which is the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the base of the brain, will produce a response when a person crosses that threshold and their performance is being affected because the stress has accumulated and has crossed that so they can't perform, you will see that they're not able to think very clearly. And that means decision making is going to be affected by that profoundly. We can't make effective decisions when we're under pressure frequently. However, what if you could actually measure people who work the best under pressure? Let's take a look at athletes as an example. The reason that the Olympics are so powerful is that every 2 years, world-class athletes who've been training are now able to break records, and they perform the best under pressure. What about that? What about that in leadership in the corporate world? So you probably know some of these guys, Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, and Tom Brady. And the reason I'm bringing them up is that the year of 2021, their passing averages was 7.5, 7.5, and 7.7. Aaron Rodgers' throws were a little bit more, had a record that year. If I were to ask you what's the best predictor of performance under pressure, most people would pick the first two, confidence and personality. I've already explained that confidence is based upon those factors of what you believe and what you feel, and they're very poor predictors of performance. Personality, interestingly enough, if you're measuring personality, you're measuring factors that don't really change. Why are you measuring factors that don't change when there's so many other factors influencing, you guessed it, decision making under pressure is the best predictor of performance? So when we look at factors that are going to influence decision making, psychologists will be studying predispositions. There are thresholds in each person. Some thresholds are lower, and as a result of that, you might become anxious sooner. Wouldn't you like to be able to identify factors in decision making that are going to influence it when you're under pressure? And that's what we've done with the athletes. And the NFL recently adopted the test of attentional interpersonal style. Um, and they used to use the Wonderlic, but they've moved towards this. Thank you. The reason I'm showing you this, and you can just hit a couple of arrows there, Ken, if you don't mind. So on the left side, you can see the left side of the brain, and that is a PET scan. It's measuring heat of the brain. Now, you can't feel it because there's no heat receptors in your brain. Now, when your brain heats up, the first thing that goes away is decision making. You cannot think very clearly. I'm sure you've had experiences when stress was great. Just because of that, no matter how good your cognitive processes were, how well you have the ability to analyze data, analysis is the first thing that gets affected, and that if that's not corrected within 90 seconds, that stress will influence performance for the next 3 to 7 minutes. So being able to determine which individuals might have lower thresholds to stress is a key factor in understanding leadership. Thank you. You can bring up the other arrows as well. Now, the reason I'm showing you this part of the brain here is this is the part of the brain which stores information in experiences of what you've done, not in terms of feeling. So when you look at where self-confidence is, and when you look at performance under pressure based upon confidence, it's affecting a part of the brain that is not the most effective way to make decisions. Self-efficacy, and you can see the highlighted areas of the brain are very different. So this is actually the lived experience that you can recall through memory, but that memory is stored in a very different portion of the brain. I'm going to highlight this in terms of women's golf. If you watch the LPGA, you will know that the Asian women, particularly the South Korean women, are playing at a higher level disproportionately to any other culture. The reason I stress that, and the reason why I look at cultural phenomenon, not just families of origins or cultures of origins, but I'm looking at how people have learned to regard others. The US spends a lot of time on confidence, and it's always about how you did. When you look at the Asian countries, an individual wants to make sure that they're going to produce um, a, a performance that is going to honor their culture, honor their family. And the US has taught that confidence is so much more important. I won't spend any more time on that now, but I wanted you to be aware that there are different parts of the brain that's going to influence performance. Actually, we know that self-compassion leadership, self-compassionate leaders use a very different part of the brains than when you see here. And self-compassionate leaders can impart their self-compassion to their teams by demonstrating that, and not by just using confidence or positive reinforcement. Thank you. Briefly, the highlighted area, you can see where the arrows are on the top, thinking, negative emotions, and autonomic responses when the body reacts to negative thinking and negative emotions. The sensory motor strip, this is what we pay attention to in sport. It's not as important in terms of what's going on in business. The other areas are, wouldn't you like to be able to regulate those negative emotions? You might be able to do that by shifting your attention away from confidence and looking at the things that you're capable of doing. And there's no doubt, once you understand what the TAIS measures, you'll be able to identify those qualities in yourself and pay more attention to the process of called attentional shifting, how to use those parts of your brain differently than the way you would be if you're only using mostly your thinking or your emotions about your decisions. Thank you. It's a very interesting study. 530,000 days of managers' time are influenced by ineffective decision making at the cost of Fortune 500 companies at $250 million in wages annually. It's a pretty profound piece of data. This is a model I came up with to help people get ready to make changes in how they understand what they're actually making decisions about. I'm sure you've all had the experience of reading a paragraph, and after you've read it, you don't remember what you've read. If I said, here's a new paragraph, find the two most important points, you would read that paragraph differently. And that is based upon your intention. So if you intend on reading the paragraph to learn the answers to those two most important points, you would make decisions very differently. You can know something and not understand it. You can know something and understand it. You can understand something and not believe it. You can understand something and believe it. You can believe things that are not true. People go to war based upon what they're believing, and as a matter of fact, that's not even true. So being able to discern what your beliefs are as whether they are reflective of the truth or not clearly is important in decision making. You can either value or not value the truth. And then eventually, when a person makes a decision, their behaviors reflect what they actually believe. So we can tell through our test administration what a person actually believes about their performance under pressure by looking at how they perform. So they're actually cognitive behaviors, overt behaviors, decision making is a clearer explanation of what a person values and what a person believes. Thank you. Some of you have had the experiences of having other assessments done in your corporation. Perhaps you're in HR, and you can see typically the Hogan, the Predictive Index, MBTI. All of those in a disc are all considered personality assessments. The MBTI is actually a personality type indicator, so it doesn't have the same kind of power as the others do in terms of the studies. And then you'll see the test of attentional and interpersonal style. Now, most of you may have never heard of this. It was developed by Dr. Robert Niederfer. Bob developed this back in his 70s. Why don't people know very much about the TAIS? Well, the TAIS uses a very specific process called consensual validation. And what's required of me is when I get a test in, I will give feedback to the individual and ask very specific questions because the data can be interpreted in more than one way. So Nidifer designed a test, which he said is that you couldn't take it and then just receive a report and not have a psychologist explain to you the meaning of it. So that's one of the reasons why most individuals have not had the experience. Some companies would see it as a cost process. I use it exclusively to begin with, and then you'll hear about the other assessments that I use. And the reason I'm doing this is that consensual validation. As a clinical psychologist, I can also gather information from the way a person is answering questions and reviewing the data. There's no other test like this in the world, and it is a test that measures performance under pressure. Thank you. There are some insights in the difference between TAIS and Hogan. Make sure you hear this. It's not an explanation that those tests aren't good measurements. It really turns out to be a philosophy, in my experience, of how to predict the best performance under pressure. As we've been looking at so far, stress can influence performance. And when you want to know how people respond to pressure, that's the reason why I use it. Thank you. These are the subtests. You might want to make this a little bit bigger for make sure that people in the audience can read this. There are a number of different factors that the TAIS measures. And most of what the TAIS is measuring are performance under pressures in what's called attentional shifting. Where do you place your attention when you're making a decision? We can actually look at a very specific process and procedure that you are relying on, whether you're being distracted by factors, whether or not there is a closed-mindedness, whether or not you like to multitask. So that's part of what the TAIS measures. We're looking at 20 different factors that can predict performance under pressure. Thank you. It is a test of attentional and interpersonal styles. So Nidifer found that where your attention is and what your interpersonal style was like, not personality, those qualities together affect decision making. Now we know that once we can highlight the areas and diagnose what the individual's issues may be, we can actually train them in higher levels of performance about whether it's cognitive processes, how to minimize distractions, how to appreciate performance under pressure. So it measures something very different than personality. We're not changing personality. We are helping individuals learn how to use their mind brain effectively to make decisions. And Nidifer, who is actually brilliant and has been my mentor for the past 30 years, if you know anything about standard deviations, and most test standard deviations are somewhere between 10 and 15 points. Bob found that some of the variabilities of the 20 different sections, the standard deviation might be only 6 points. So if you start looking at the numbers, you're going to make errors in making the interpretation. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that when I do an interpretation of an assessment, I'm looking at probably 3 to 5 variables at one time and looking at their interaction. Understanding that some variables have more impact on decision making, and the way in which they're organized together will be the best predictor of performance under pressure. By the way, the test is used with the Navy SEALs. It's used with the FBI, the CIA. So in addition to being used with all athletes, and in addition to being used in the military, it's also used in corporate America. Here's an example of a company that we worked in. We had, I think, about 30 people. And so we've blocked out the names at the bottom. And so when we did the interpretation to these leaders, which happened to be very high performers in a very large financial organization, and showed them where their scores were and where their the individuals on their team scores were. All of the individuals agreed to be able to share their scores with the members of their team and clearly the leadership. We could start to identify scores that were highly aware. Now, you would think that a person whose awareness was low might not be a really good decision maker. In this case, I was debriefing an individual and their awareness score was relatively low, in a very high position of leadership. And when I asked him about his background, he explained to me he was trained as a physician. And the reason why that was important is that he was using a triage method of how he gathered data. So he only included in his awareness things that were necessary. Are you including information that's not necessary? We say all information is necessary. Well, I'm not sure that that's true, particularly under pressure. CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, CTOs, all will have pressure. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out, do you narrow your attention or do you gather your attention? And is it more efficient to open your attention, increase your awareness, or narrow it down your decision making? That's a simple example of what we measure. Thank you. This measures analysis, and you can see that in this group of performers, a huge number were fairly high in their analysis. Now, the problem with analysis is when you're under pressure, if you're stressed, the first thing that gets affected is analysis. So, understanding that they were relying on it, but also understanding it might affect their performance unless they manage their stress effectively. So, not only are we looking at the ability to analyze data, we're looking at how to be able to manage the stress so you can analyze the data more effectively. Thank you. We're not going to spend much time on this. This is only to highlight a number of different areas. And so you can see where the norms are and the variability of the differences between the executive norms. This happened to be managers. We have norms for all types of companies, finance, manufacturing. We've done some pretty good work with shipping companies as well. And what we're looking at then is that we can look at teams of what areas they're defined in, and then make a comparison of their scores to high-level performances of leadership. If you go to the next slide, it'll become clearer. If you could make that bigger, I think that would be great. Actually, it looks like it might be smaller. I'm sorry. So I don't know if you can read this on the screen, but you can look at decision-making styles, and you can see that the norms that are higher on the first one actually shows that that's slower decision-making speed. Information processing, which is multitasking, less tolerance for change. They become much more rigid. You can see that there's a whole bunch of data points here that's going to help us understand what will actually take place. We know that self-critical scores will be at a score of 58 versus 35 will influence performance under pressure because it actually disrupts the ability to think clearly. Okay? I'm not sure that's in a presentation mode, Ken. Can you go to the next slide? Ken, I'm sorry, I can't. Ken, can you jump on? I'm sorry for the disruption here. While we're getting that adjusted, I'm going to go to the next slide and explain to you about the TAIS. The TAIS measures your attention that's outside of you and inside of you. So either you're gathering data from external sources or from internal sources. Once you've done that in a very broad way, you bring it inside of you and you start to um, interpret the data. Now, you don't take the data and make the decision very quickly if analysis is necessary. If you're intuitive, you'll do that. But if not, um, you may need another process, which is going to require the analysis. As the data is brought into you and you start utilizing the process of thinking differently, you'll be able to make decisions. Um, Ken, can you jump on so I can just I'm sorry, I can't reach Ken, so I'm not sure, and I don't have control over the slides here, so I apologize for the difficulties with this. What I was going to show you was a series of slides that was able to contrast preferences of individuals on a team. We could break down the team into very specific aspects of the 20 different scores and then compile them so we can start to predict who is going to perform at their highest level of or under pressure, and keeping that in mind. So we would then take a look at factors that influence. Ken?
I do apologize. We have experienced a critical system failure on our end. So, yes, this is performance under pressure.
Oh.
I do apologize. Give me just a moment. We will get our systems back up and running again. Um, Give me just one moment. I think we're almost there. Let's see if we can get ourselves back up and running here. And
If you can go to slide 31.
31. Okay, yeah, let's jump there. All right. Very good. I believe we are back up and running, and so we can continue from there. Sorry about that.
Okay. Can you make that slide bigger?
Yes, let me pop that up here. There we go.
The reason I wanted you to be able to see this, all of these X's are referring to the scores on the TAIS. And what we're looking at here is called extroversion, introversion. Introversion psychologically is not how social you are. Introversion psychologically is how self-reliant you are. So, for example, high introverts are very self-reliant. High extroverts are very social. We're looking at the interaction between those as to predict how the individuals are going to perform under pressure and how they're going to relate to others. So this is a great interaction between attention, where's your attention, your decision making, and the interpersonal style. So you can see that the first individual whose score is extroversion is 99 is that they're highly extroverted. Their introversion is relatively low, 5, and since they're a strong extrovert, we know that they're going to be very other directed. And their influence of decision making is going to be influenced mostly by other people. These individuals will do very well in interacting with others, but you might see them making decisions based on trying to please others. When you see the score at the bottom of the three, where it says the extroversion is 31, we know that those individuals might not be as sensitive to others, and they're introversion is going to make them somewhat confrontational at times. So you can see that by analyzing different qualities of functioning of the individual, how decision making will be made, very different than personalities. You can move on to the next slide. Now, this is complicated, and the reason I just want you to see this, psychological energy is one of the processes that we pay attention to because my work is diagnostic, prognostic, and prescriptive. Psychological energy is a construct to look at how people have abilities to be able to perform at a high level based upon the energy that's available. Now, what you would find is that some individuals may suffer from anxiety. Those individuals that suffer from anxiety might actually drive down some of their psychological energy, which means their distractibility might be increasing, and the performance under pressure, you can see the score is relatively low. So psychological energy as a construct will help us predict what's going to happen in the future as we're trying to gain the ability to influence higher levels of performance. I'm looking at some other areas we should take a look at. So if you can move now to 34, next one. Okay, so the work that we do is diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive, and then we actually do some interventions. In the DNA of leadership, and you can see the next slide, this is an example of corporation where someone who was a CFO was applying for a CEO position. And the CEO, who was, we were doing succession planning for them, thought that this might be a good candidate. Can move on. And what we found is that when we did the analysis, there was only one very favorable quality of the four that the company recognized, and we recognized that were good predictors of performance. He was a very critical leader, but his need for control, his analysis, and his support were not very effective. So we knew that in a leadership way, those factors would become problematic. The next slide will show we put together what's called the playbook. And what we do in a playbook is we give a very brief review of what we think is necessary for the individual to perform at a higher level. And then I actually write a prescription. This benchmark was actually compiled by our analytics team. So for example, this test allows us to go in, as long as we have a group of 30 people, we can produce the norms for that company. We could identify who the high-level performers are and start to see which of the qualities are essential for high-level leadership based specifically on that company, and if large enough, even that department when we're working with global corporations. So John Smith, this fictitious name, you could see that his support score is at 29. In comparison to other high-level performers, that was an 87. That's why he wouldn't fit into the model of leadership in that company. You can move on. This is an example of pre-test, post-test experiences. So what you can see is before, when I started working with the individuals, where the scores were. In this case, the focus was relatively low, distractibility was significantly high, anxiety was high, and the need for control was low. This was followed up on a 12-month basis after coaching. And you can see performance. So one of the benefits of using a TAIS is there's a pre-test, post-test model. Okay, thank you. Ken, I know you wanted to spend a little more time on this. We probably won't have that right now. But what I've done here is I've looked at the whole process of empathy. I was charged with the responsibility of working with a corporation and trying to help them develop. One of their mission statement is to be more empathic. Now, emotional empathy is very, very hard to identify clearly. And to some extent, I'm not sure that it actually exists the way people believe it does. How do you know that you really know what another person is feeling? Most people report, well, I've had similar experiences. That doesn't guarantee that that other person had the same experience of feeling. However, if you spent more time on understanding cognitive empathy, the way a person thought, you could then start to predict how a person has arrived at a very specific way of behaving emotionally. So I've developed a model for cognitive empathy training. We won't have time to go over today. I apologize. Go to the next slide and to the next one. Thank you. So this is another one of the tests that we use, which is the Cognitive Processing Profile, the CPP. And what this does is measure the way in which a person uses their cognitive process. Again, we're not looking at personality. We're not looking at decision making. We're looking at the way in which they use their mind brain in processing data. So we found that 80% of C-suite is down in what's called operational and diagnostic and accumulation processes that are not as sophisticated as pure strategy. So when we look this over, this is the data that we have. So we go into corporations and we have to measure what the cognitive processing skills are like. And the next slide. This is an exploration of C-suite, and you can see CEOs and CTOs. Now, the CTOs, you can look at their cognitive processing is very different than a CEO. It doesn't make them better, but we know that these qualities fit in with those types of leadership. Why aren't we measuring cognitive processes? Why aren't we measuring decision making under pressure processes? Why are we measuring personality? You can move on to the next one. We can move past this one. And the last of the tests that I'll be reviewing today is a test that is measuring a values system. We write our own 360 questions. And the reason that we write our own 360 questions, we're trying to figure out what's the specific area that you want to be able to identify about a leader and what areas they need to modify here. This is a model of a cultural phenomenon and value system. It's based upon 6 different theories. And at the beginning of this, down here at the lowest level, this is right above Maslow's hierarchies of needs, of having your basic needs addressed. And what the research showed is that either the individual is more group-oriented or individually oriented, and then we start to find what values that they have, because values are also going to affect decisions. Next slide. This is an example of the person who evaluated themselves and said, these are the values. Now, other people disagreed with their values, and this is the way they saw the person. Now, the reason I think that this is important to understand is that when you look at teams, if you have a number of people who don't regard the leadership's value system to be the same as theirs, they're going to have a very different perspective. And you can see that the 360 questions will be tainted by the way in which these individuals are seeing them. The next slide. And this is an example. So where this score, which is altruism, their leader was very highly altruistic. A number of them were rejecting altruism. It looks like 7 out of the 7 people that took the test. So not only can we identify what the value system is for the leader, we can also look at people that might be taking a 360 and see whether or not there's a bias based upon a value. Now, this is not necessarily about cultural values, but it is about the values that are necessary in high-level leadership. Next one. Change takes place in only 3 basic ways. Maturation, you couldn't ride a bike if you were only 2 days old. Coercion affects change. We've all been an example of the experience of that during the pandemic. Crisis also will move people into behaving differently. These factors are not the most effective ways of looking at how change will take place. Discomfort will produce change. If you're too uncomfortable, you won't change. If you're not uncomfortable enough, you won't change. And the act of the will is when the person is making up their mind. If you understood how the person was making decisions, you could see that they're willing themselves into those decisions is based upon that process that they're depending upon cognitively, the decision-making strategy, and the value system. And I'll end right there. I apologize for the technical issues. I'll leave some time for questions.
Excellent. Well, Nick, I do apologize for the technical difficulties there, but would love to hear if there are any thoughts, questions from you folks as you've been listening here today. Really appreciate the insight that we have here, Nick, and the opportunity to engage with a deeper understanding of how do we make these decisions under pressure. And you just had this slide up with maturation, coercion, crisis, discomfort, and active will. And my question is there any one of those that's more influential in the change process? I mean, obviously
Uh,
maturation, I mean, we get older and we mature, but
right.
of the others.
Well, certainly maturation, just because I mean it's longitudinal,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's going to affect part of that. So when you look at different parts of the brain, obviously we're looking at adults, so we wouldn't be as concerned about that. But you can see that theories mature. And so not only are individuals maturing, but the person's theory of decision making also matures. So I would be looking at that as one example of it, but not from a physiologic perspective. The reason that the act of the will is so important in decision making is because that's going to reflect the person's integration of the things that we've been talking about, which is the cultural phenomenon, their cognitive processes, and the way in which they will attend to um, where their attention needs to be. Should it be more on value? Should it be more on analysis? And being able to look at the interpersonal factors. So each of those are going to play a part in the decision making process. The act of the will is the one I think is the most robust because it represents the individual's performance, not based upon outside factors, such as when you look at degree of discomfort, the discomfort might be coming from the pressure from the corporation.
Sure, sure.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've recently been going through John Maxwell's 5 levels of leadership with some of our FCCI groups, and when he gets to the level of people development, one of the things that he brings out that I think is so critical is our ability to enable other people to succeed. And obviously, this TAIS process. Talk to us about as company leaders, company owners, senior managers, delivering this, actually leveraging this testing process within our organizations. Talk to us about that, the actual application of it as we try to help develop leaders within our organization.
understanding is the most essential process in human belonging. A person will not feel like they belong unless they feel understood.
Sure.
Now, is the understanding that we are relying on how a person's relating to one another solely. And that's when my concern is about personality. When you look at other factors, such as a cultural phenomenon, again, not family of origin or country of origin, and when you look at the ability of cognitive processes, if you understood that, wouldn't that make a big difference in terms of the unity?
Hmm.
No one will feel like a sense of belonging takes place until that understanding occurs. I'm imploring, high-level leaders to make sure that they're demonstrating understanding.
Hmm.
When understanding occurs, belonging uh, develops, and that's how the culture increases in function because we don't exist in isolation. Humans want to exist within an organization, within a culture, with a sense of belonging.
Hmm. Let me pull up one of the questions that has popped in here, and let me just grab that. Oh, let's pull this one up. There we go. Um, so, am I understanding correctly that you are evaluating a leader compared to the team they lead, and someone could lead one group and be a great leader and move to a different group and not be as effective?
Yes, we have the option to do that. So when we start to take a look at what's the quality, the responsibilities of the leadership.
Hmm.
And when we go in, we do a lot of work, obviously, with key stakeholders that tell us what's essential for that leadership position. And if we're able to look at the team's dynamics, we then can see whether or not we want to work with one of those individuals, the leader, or whether we want the group to work together. And then we'll do dyadical or triads or eventually a team process. So the answer to this is yes. I think that we are very effectively able to measure the differences and explain why an individual in one department will perform at a higher level than they would in another department.
I think that's just so incredible because so often we struggle to understand those uniquenesses of how that team would function well, and to actually have a system whereby we can make that analysis and make a decision based on the data, is just absolutely critical. We've got another question popping in here. Let me just pull that up real quick. And Steve asking, when stress levels shut down creative problem solving, how should a leader identify the root issues, maybe strategy and long term? Tactically, what should the leader do for most immediate impact?
Creativity is actually based on the right side of the brain.
Hmm.
And when you saw what was happening, and I showed you on the left side of the brain where the analysis is, the analytic piece is going to be affected, and it can actually move over into the creative area as well. So the key here is to find a more effective way of managing the stress, first of all. The root issues, so we can look at this, are we going to treat the symptoms, or are we going to treat the etiology? So clearly, if we can figure out what the etiology is, but wouldn't it be important if you could identify that ahead of time, so that when you're hiring someone, you might know who might be more predisposed to that? And if that's the case, and we're able to identify what those stressors are, we could maybe able to manage the stressors within a corporation that would influence the performance of the leader.
Mm. No, that's fantastic. Well, thank you, Nick. I know we're running out of time. Apologize again that we lost a little bit of time there with the technical issues today. So, to all the folks that have been with us here today, thank you so much. I've been seeing Bonnie Mock, Brian Middleton, Ron Henry, and others from around the country, around the world. Great to have all of you here with us today, and thank you so much for being a part of today's webinar. So, Dr. Nick, we'll look forward to having folks connect with you following our webinar today, and look into the opportunities to take this the next step and engage further in their organization. So,
Thank you kindly for the
thank you.
opportunity, Ken. I
Oh,
appreciate it.
thank you very, very much. All right. Well, as we wrap up here, let me just give you a quick reminder that we continue to grow here at FCCI, and we're excited about the opportunity to engage more leaders in group facilitation. So, if you would have an interest in having great influence in the lives of others within FCCI, please reach out to Steve Campbell at steve@fcci.org. We'd love to hear more about your interest to be involved. And for next month, our webinar, we are excited to be welcoming Curtis Chang to come and speak. There have been a number of our FCCI groups that have gone through his content that's entitled Your Organizational Life. And he's going to be speaking about God's purpose for your organization from a biblical perspective. How do we understand God's intent for us as leaders and for our organization itself? God's intent for the organization. What is it meant to do? How is it meant to function in the world today and actually be a transformative agent in our world today? So, look forward to having you join us for next month's webinar as well. As I mentioned, we'll get that email out to you with more information about how to connect with Dr. Molinaro and learn more. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.